Good evening and welcome to the Caroline Cymru History Revision Sessions for AS Level History. My name is Mr Andrew Mel. I'm a teacher at Llanelloes High School in the deepest, darkest mid-Wales. And as you can see behind me with the Market Hall, the feature of Llanelloes, oldest timber frame building in the UK. So what the plan is, right, is over the course of these 4 weeks, I will deliver a number of 4 sessions focusing on different elements of the History AS course. Throughout the sessions, then, if you have got any questions, and please feel free to post them in the question and answer section, which is in the top right-hand corner of your screen. And then for about 5 minutes at the end of each session, I will answer some of those questions and try and enhance your understanding as a result. So, my name is Andrew, or Mr. Morel, whatever you want to say, and my job then is to give you an overall view of History at AS. So this is the plan of the sessions then, right? Today we'll focus on Unit 2 and Question 1, principally focusing on how to master it. Next session at the same time, next week, will be Unit 2, but looking at Question 2, that interpretation question. Following week then will be Unit 1 on how to manage the content and focusing on the concepts of Unit 1 content. Before then, the next one will be about essay writing and developing reason arguments, how to improve your essay writing for both question 1 and 2 in the Unit 1 exam. So the first thing for me to say really, right, is AS History is made up of 2 units, Unit 1 and Unit 2. Now, Unit 2, right, Unit 1 has got is a breadth paper, right? Unit 1 is a breadth paper over a long time period, probably 100 years, right? All of them are 100 years, I think maybe one's 98 years long, okay? Whilst Unit 2 is a depth study, right? So it's over a shorter period of time, but you look at that shorter period of time in greater depth. And in terms of the exam, right, your Unit 2 exam has question 1, which is a compulsory source question, and question 2, which is a compulsory interpretation question. Both of which you have no choice in at all. You've got to answer, right? When it comes to the Unit 1 exam, you've got Section A and Section B. I'm not sure why it's taken so long to answer. Section A and Section B, of which there is a choice in both. The exam for Unit 1 is 15 minutes shorter than the exam for Unit 2. Now, Unit 2 topics that you may be studying will be one of these following ones, right? It might be the mid-Tudor crisis in Wales and England. It might be royalty, rebellion and republic. It might be reform and protest in Wales and England. It might be politics and society in Wales and England. It might be the religious reformation in Europe, France and revolution, crisis of the American Republic, or Germany, democracy and dictatorship. During my figures from the exam board, the majority of people tend to do option 8, Germany, democracy and dictatorship, and that's actually what I've taught in the past, and so that's what I'll be using examples from today. But the important thing for me to say is these 4 weeks won't be focusing on content, because if I do, then those of you doing other options, this won't be relevant to at all. So instead, I'm going to focus on the skills, and I'll use various content from various options in order to exemplify that. But the skills and the way you'll answer these exam questions is exactly the same across all of these options. Just the same for 5 as it is for 8, just the same as it is for 1 as it is for 2. So to make sure you're aware of the content, right, the following website is really useful, okay? Go into the WJC website and searching for the History AS qualification in order to find out the specification, right? The elements that are in your specification. Your teacher or your lecturer may already have given you it, but nonetheless, it's a good place to go and start to see what content you need to know, what time period 100% it's within, and what specific bits in it you need to know. And by following that, right, you'll come up with a specification that looks like this, right? This is it for option 8, Germany from democracy to dictatorship. And what it does then is it sets out for you the kinds of things that you will have done in class and the things on which the exam board will ask the questions on in the exam. They may give you a source or an interpretation for Unit 2 on any of these elements. So getting your head around that by downloading it from the WJC website is a really good place to start, right? Because it tells you what content you need to know and what content you don't need to know as well, right? Because there's no point wasting your time on content you don't need to know, on things they won't necessarily ask you questions about. So As I said, today we'll focus on Unit 2, right? And actually the next session we'll focus on Unit 2 as well. The 2 weeks after, we'll then focus on Unit 1. Now, Unit 2 has got one source-based question, question 1, and one interpretation-based question, question 2. And they are both compulsory. There's no choice in these questions. So if you like the topic or not, you're going to have to answer it. And in total then, that exam is about 1 hour, 45 minutes. The slight additional length of time in comparison to the Unit 1 exam is based on your giving you time in order to process those sources, those interpretations. So it's not just about writing time. There's also processing time, thinking time there for you to look at those source interpretations and try and work out the best way to approach it, the key things you need to look at. So today we will focus on that source-based question. And we'll be looking at the skills associated with it, what types of things you need to be doing. I'll give you a checklist of the types of things you need to be doing. Now, the first thing for me to say, right, and this is brilliant, I've got like a crystal ball in my hand that I can look into it and I can tell you that every single time you get a question 1, it will always start in the same way. It will always start with reference to the sources and your understanding of the historical context, assess the value of these 3 sources to a historian studying blank. And it will always be 30 marks. No matter what option you're doing, no matter what year you're doing it in, it will always start like that. And it will also always be compulsory. There will be no choice in it. So here's an example, right? Specimen assessment for option 6. Here we go. With reference to the sources and your understanding of historical context, assess the value of these 3 sources to an historian studying the causes of the French Revolution. You can see my crystal ball is working wonders at the moment. Next one, right? Option 3. This is from the 2019 exam paper. Now, my crystal ball is working even better again because, here we go, with reference to the sources and your understanding of the historical context, assess the value of these 3 sources to a historian studying the changing policies of Tory governments in the period 1820 to 1827. And my crystal balls are getting really hot at the moment because it's just working overdrive. Here we go, option 8, 2016 exam paper. With reference to the source and your understanding of historical context, assess the value of these 3 sources to a historian studying the problems facing the Weimar Republic, 1919 to 1930. So it doesn't matter what option, doesn't matter what exam paper, what year, they will always, question 1 will always start in the same way. And that actually is a brilliant thing because it makes it easier for you to know what to do. So, a little pointer about these 3 sources before we kind of delve into the detail in looking at what it is we do. Now we know these questions are always going to start in the same way. Well, all 3 sources will be primary or contemporary made at the time, right? For question 1, they'll all be primary or contemporary sources that made at the time. They will probably be 2 written and 1 pictorial source. They may be 3 written sources. I have seen it 3 written sources, but these 3 examples I gave you here were 2 written and 1 pictorial, weren't they? So that's the general pattern, but they may well be 3 written. You should use around 15 minutes to evaluate the sources and 45 minutes to write up your response. So what I said about that extra 15 minutes, that is specifically thinking time, processing time. And throughout, you're going to need to consider the strengths and limitations of the sources. They are looking for analysis, and then the way to analysis is to look at the strengths and limitations. And crucially, it's within the context of the specific key issue rather than the depth study as a whole. So I'll just go backward for a second to this paper, right? When we're thinking about the key issue, we're thinking about this element, right? We're thinking about problems facing the Weimar Republic. So this comes from option 8, right? Democracy to dictatorship. So it's not about the strengths and limitations of these sources understanding democracy to dictatorship. It's about the strengths and weaknesses of these sources in relation to problems facing the Weimar Republic. So if question 1 always looks the same, then we always can do the same thing. So this checklist of what you need to do will always apply, right? And we're going to keep coming back to this again and again and again, right? This checklist is going to serve you well because as the question always looks the same, you can always use the same checklist. So the first thing you need to do is identify that key issue in the question. As I said, strengths and limitations about the key issue in the question, not the whole option. So before you do that, you need to know what the key issue is, don't you? You need to look at the provenance of the source, the date it was made, the author of it, the audience it's aimed at, the form in which it takes, the language used. You need to look at the content of the source, the tone of the source. Now, this is important and a little bit more tricky, but we'll go over it and we'll give you some examples. The reliability of the source, and also the wider context. The wider context helps you to explain that source and ultimately to talk about its value. So what we'll do is we'll do this for this exam paper here, right? Option 8, 2016 exam paper. Now, what I should say is that this resource will be up on the Carlam Cymru website, and so you'll be, and this video of it as well, so you'll be able to go back over it, pause it, etc., as much as you want. I've done it for all three sources. I'm conscious of the time, right, and the fact that we'll have 35, 40-minute discussion and 5 minutes question at the end. Then I might not be able to do all three sources now, but the resource to do all those three sources will be up on the website. So, yep, you might not be doing option 8, right? You might be doing another one, but nonetheless, this is the skills, that we'll go through here are going to be exactly the same skills you'll need to use whatever option it is you're doing. So here's our checklist. This is what we're going to keep coming back to again and again as we go through. Our green ticks will increase time and time again. So identify the key issue in the question, right? What are the key things to do and what's the issue? This is to ensure that we are focused during it. So first thing, the key terms, right? The key term essentially is assess the value. So that means you've got to constantly refer to the value. Is this source of value? Is it not of value? And using simple statements like this source is valuable to a historian because are key things to do. You're signposting the examiner to the fact you're answering a specific question. So key terms. Key issue then in this question is problems facing the Weimar Republic. So all of these sources we've now got to evaluate and analyze in the context of problems facing the Weimar Republic. And the date range, 1919 to 1930. Now this is important because if you discuss things that are outside of this time period, then it's not creditworthy. You can't get marks for it in the exam because it's outside of the time period. You might have some amazing stuff to talk about the weakness of Weimar Republic, given the fact it began in 1918, right? But you can't discuss that because it's outside of the time period. So your date range, you've identified that as well. So happy days, we've identified the key issue in the question. Now there are three sources that are going to help us answer this specific question. So that's why you need to look at the provenance of the source, content, tone, context, reliability, judgment, ultimately how valid. You need to look at that 3 times, right? Once for each source. And do it one paragraph at a time, one source at a time as a paragraph. Do all these things for one source, all these for the second, all of these for the third. And then you can come to your overall judgment. So let's jump in, right? We'll jump into that first source and we'll go through it. We'll see what we've got here and we'll go through it. So, as I say, we'll look at source A to start with. I've done source B and source C on the slide and hopefully we'll have time to get to them and we'll kind of build up an idea of what we're doing then. So, we're starting with provenance, right? I've got the question at the bottom here just to remind you of it as we go along. We're going to start with provenance. That's looking at our dates, our authorship, our audience, form, language, etc. And so the first thing, right, in those 15 minutes of processing, what I suggest you do, quite simply, is you highlight or underline that relevant information in the attribution being this bottom bit here. And that helps you to put the source into context before you even read it. You already know the perspective it might take. You could almost predict possibly the types of thing they might say. So if we think about this initially, right, this source is written in January 1919. So it's the very, very beginning of our period for this question, right? Our period question is 1919. Sorry, I was trying to be fancy there. I'll stop. Now, it's important it's January 1919, isn't it? Because this is very early on in the Weimar Republic, right? It's kind of very early weakness, possibly. Authorship, well, this is written by Rosa Luxemburg, right? A leading German communist. So this is where your knowledge of the period will come in, right? That you could explain that a communist fundamentally doesn't agree with the Weimar Republic. Rosa Luxemburg, the leader of the Spartacus uprising that occurred in January 1919. So, by looking at these things, even before you've looked at the content of the source, you can start to predict maybe the types of things that might be said. Now, when it's written in an article entitled House of Cards published in a communist newspaper, our audience is going to be fellow sympathetic communists. It's not going to be people abroad. It's not going to be people that agree with the Weimar Republic. It's going to be communists. She's almost preaching to the converted in many ways, isn't she? The form is a written source, isn't it? Right? And an article in a newspaper, an article in a newspaper. That's the form that it takes, and that's what we can comment on as well, right? The form of it being an article in a newspaper means it's probably going to be more discussive, right? It's going to be more of a discussion than a polemic, right, or something that states a position. It's going to be more discursive. So we started then by looking at the provenance, right? And that's the type of thing, well, that's the thing you can write up, right? You write this in the paragraph. Begin your paragraph. Source A, written by Rosa Luxemburg, a leading German communist, someone who fundamentally disagreed with the Weimar Republic and its idea of democracy, etc. So therefore, right, we have looked at the provenance. That provenance, as I said, has probably helped us predict already what it's going to say, right? Prediction, I've read the source, but prediction probably it's going to say something like the Weimar Republic shouldn't exist. It has turned to use the army and the Freikorps to put down a rebellion, and it shows that it's going to be brutal, it's going to be violent, right? You can always predict it. So let's have a look at what the source does tell us, right? Well, the source does tell us that amongst smoking ruins between the pools of blood and the corpses of murdered Spartacists, the so-called heroes of order hasten to entrench their rule. The Weimar government is setting to work with frenzied energy to consolidate its power. Henceforth, it will rule by the bayonet. This is how Ebert, Scheidemann, and the others hope to re-establish their governing power, with material assistance of the counter-revolutionary military, the Freikorps, and the army. Today, it's obvious that Ebert and Scheidemann can only rule by the bayonet. The bourgeoisie is going all out for the restoration of the old order. So if, as I've circled here, we're looking at the context of the problems facing the Weimar, what content is going to be most important to us here? Well, if we're thinking about problems of Weimar, then henceforth ruling by the bayonet is going to be important here, isn't it? It's given us an idea of the type of authority, type of power it is going to use. Also, it's talking about the re-establishing their governing power, hoping to re-establish their governing power. If it's helping to re-establish it, then it means it's lost it in the first place, isn't it? So that is a problem facing Weimar Germany, that it's lost its governing power. And also, right, it's referring to the material assistance of the counter-revolutionary military, the Freikorps, and the army, particularly the Freikorps, an organization that doesn't owe its allegiance to the Weimar democracy, to the German government. They relied on it to re-establish authority. And lastly, it talks about the bourgeoisie is going all out for the restoration of the old order. These are the problems that this source tells us the Weimar government is facing. The bourgeoisie, in the context of communists as well, right? That ruling elite looking to re-establish the old order. Possibly a little hint there, isn't there, about the cat putsch that could come, the attempt by the ruling class, the old generals and stuff, to try and re-establish a right-wing dictatorship. So you're identifying the content from the source that is specifically going to help you with the focus of that question, problems facing Weimar Republic. So again, just like you've written up your provenance, you write up your content, okay? This content help us to explain the source and the problems facing Weimar Republic. So, content of the source, tick. Tone of the source, right? What is the source's tone? How does it come across? Well, in this case, I'd go so far as to say it's almost aggressive and angry. Here we've got smoking ruins, right? So-called, ruled by bayonet. They're all kind of quite angry, aggressive terms. It's definitely very reactionary, right? It's reactionary of the left, trying to throw any mud that'll stick at the Weimar Republic. And it's also, right, given the context that we know by this stage, the Spartacist revolution, how Spartacist uprising has happened and failed, it's also a bit mournful. We haven't been able to succeed. We were instead ruled by the bayonet. We were instead put down by the military and the Freikorps. So identifying that tone also helps us to understand whether or not this source has got value. If it's aggressive and it's angry and it's mournful, is it going to be objective? Is it going to be that thing that's able to give us a clear historical record? Or is it actually deeply subjective? Is it someone else's perspective? And in this case, I think because of that anger, that aggression, that mournfulness, we can say it's deeply subjective. And as a result, maybe it's not so valuable in telling us about the Weimar Republic as a whole, but it is very, very good at giving us, or very, very valuable, use those words of a question as I was failing to do there, very, very valuable for telling us about the perspective of someone who disagreed with Weimar government. So, tone of the source, done. Moving on to context, right? Got to kind of put this in context, and here's my example for you, right? I am absolutely not giving you the V. All sources must be analysed in the historical context, right? This means using what's happening around the source of interpretation to comment on it, right? Without that context, you can't properly explain it, right? As I said, it might look there like I'm flicking you the V's, right? I'm absolutely not, I promise. It's Churchill, obviously, right? But without that context, without that wider picture, you could very easily see that it's someone flicking you the V's. And so you can see from that, can't you, that the context helps explain everything. It helps to give it that bigger picture. So for this source, you need to be thinking about the context, right? It's additional information that helps to explain why that source was made in the first place and what's happening at the time. So in this case, think about what's happening when this source was made, right? The Spartacus uprising had just taken place, hadn't it? So you could give some detail about it. That helps to explain why this author, why Rosa Luxemburg is writing as she is writing. The government had relied on the Freikorps to put the rebellion down. It was one of 3 attempts between 1919 and 1923, or one of 3 serious attempts to seize power. That all helps to explain this context, doesn't it, right? If they're talking about ruling by the bayonet, well, there's no wonder why they're ruling by the bayonet if they're facing 3 genuine attempts to seize power. Far right posed a big threat at this period of time as well, eventually leading to the Cat Putsch. And it reflects a lack of wider belief, or a wider lack of belief, in this new type of Germany as well. You've got the left and the right not believing in this new type of Germany. So that context helps you to explain that source. So just like you've written up, right, the provenance, about the author, what shapes their thinking. Just like then you've written about the content, what the content tells you about the problems. Then you've written up about the tone, right up about the context as well. What is the context of the time? How does that explain the source? How does that add to the value or take away from the value of that source? Context, done. Reliability then, key. If it's not reliable, then it's going to have less value, isn't it? So we're thinking here about objectivity versus subjectivity. If something's objective, then it's a source which informs, right? It's balanced, it's factual, rather than being biased and opinionated. If it's subjective, then it refers to information that is based on personal opinions, right? It's not balanced, it's not factual, it's based on people's personal opinions. So the key things to do here, right, are to think about bias, about audience, about purpose. Why is this person writing it, right? If they're writing it in their diary, it's going to have a very different purpose than if they're writing it in a communist newspaper about the failure of the uprising that they've just taken part in. And that is going to change the reliability, and ultimately it's going to change the value to you as a historian. So in this case, right, we're thinking, so obviously as you've got here, we've got everything we've been talking about so far. We've got our attribution, we've got our content, we've got our tone. We can also think, right, in terms of who it is that's made this, right, are they subjective or objective? Well, this source is made by communists. They are anti-democracy. They are anti-Weimar democracy. And so it's going to be highly subjective and it's going to be highly opinionated, particularly given the aggressive, angry, mournful tone of it. And these things you're all writing this up in your source analysis as you go. So reliability of the source, done. Last thing then is to make your judgment, how valid. And this is where you need to make 100% sure you're looking at both sides. You can't just say it isn't valid. You can't just say it is valid. You've got to look at both sides. So when we're thinking about what makes a source more valid, we're thinking about the strengths, we're thinking about the perspective it gives us, and we're talking about the value of it. What makes a source less valid is its weaknesses. maybe omissions, things it doesn't mention, or things it fails to mention, biases, and limitations as well. So with reference to this source, right, what can we say? Well, what adds to its validity is that it is the feelings from the far left. It is from the perspective of the biggest early risks of Weimar. So if we're looking at the problems facing Weimar, then it is very valuable for understanding about the biggest problem that faced the early Weimar Republic from their own opinion. And that's always valid. Every source has got value, right? Even if it's just understanding the perspective of a highly biased person, it's still always got value. And only the left's perspective takes away from this, right? This isn't a middle option. This isn't giving us both perspectives. This isn't a historian who spent a long time researching both perspectives. It only gives us one perspective. They failed to overthrow Weimar democracy, so that limits, right, what they can actually comment on about the weaknesses of Weimar, because they've obviously failed to identify the actual weaknesses of Weimar. Otherwise, they'd have been able to tap into them, overthrow them, and be their own communist regime. And of course, it's highly, highly biased, isn't it? Right? You don't need me to say that. German communist anywhere, right? Highly, highly biased. So that's for source one, right? Judgment as well. So we've looked at the provenance, we looked at the content, the tone, the context, reliability, and made a judgment. How valid is it? And as I said, we need to do that 3 times, right? Once per source. And it's literally paragraph 1, do it for source A. Paragraph 2, do it for source B. Paragraph 3, do it for source C. Don't make it more complicated than that. So let's do the same then for source B, right? So source B, again, we start with the provenance. So highlight, underline anything that's relevant in the attribution. So in this case, right, we can highlight the fact that it's written by the German foreign minister. So he's at the heart of government decision making. So therefore, he may well be well versed in understanding what the problems are. It's a speech to the League of Nations, right? So he, in terms of his audience, he's going to be tailoring this to the audience, isn't he? If it's a speech, it's probably going to be only a limited view. Because if it's a speech, you're limiting your view based on who your audiences are going to be. And in this case, the League of Nations, the countries that Germany at the time really wanted to impress upon. They wanted to be seen as an equal to. And writing in September 1926, this is interesting, isn't it? Because it's not long, or the same year as Germany joins the League of Nations. It is not long after the Kellogg-Briand Pact, not long after Locarno, not long after the Dawes Plan, where Germany is very reliant on the international climate. So again, we can kind of think, what is this source going to tell us? Before we even read the source, what is this source going to tell us about the problems? Well, if he's the German foreign minister speaking to the League of Nations during September 1926, he's probably not going to say there's very many problems, is he? He's not going to want to identify those problems to the League of Nations, to those other countries. He's not going to want to make his country seem weak, is he? So, provenance done. When we look at content then, we can start to see that, right? In many ways, League of Nations is the heir and the executor of the treaties of 1919. Out of these treaties, there have arisen in the past many differences and problems between the League and Germany. And there we can see maybe a hint at a problem, right? Differences between the two. They're not necessarily on the same page as the international climate. I hope that our cooperation with the League will now make it easier to discuss these differences and resolve these problems. Even before her entry into the League, Germany endeavoured to promote friendly cooperation. The action which she took and which led to the Pact of Locarno is proof of this. The German government is resolved to persevere unswervingly in this line of policy and is glad to see that these ideas, which at first met with lively opposition in Germany, are now becoming deeply rooted in the conscience of the German people. So another hint of a problem here, right, which at first met with lively opposition in Germany, right? So I kind of predicted it right, didn't I? Right? Yeah, I've read the source before, so am I really predicting or what? But nonetheless, these aren't obvious problems that he's referring to, is he? He's not openly stating, well, we're ruling by the bayonet, because he's a German foreign minister speaking to people across the world. He's not going to want to appear weak in front of those people, is he? So, again, right, making sure it's in the context of the question, problems facing Weimar Germany, we've done our content. And you simply write that up, right? He says this, he suggests this. So when we're looking at the tone, right, same thing again, isn't it? The tone, well, the tone is quite statesmanlike. It's very matter of fact. It's kind of respectful yet firm, And that gives it almost more validity, doesn't it, right? If he's being matter of fact. He's not highly opinionated, highly objective at this point. Highly subjective at this point. He's not impassioned because he's just lost power and he's likely to be executed at any minute, like Rosa Luxemburg. And so that tone helps us to make a judgment on the validity of the source. You know, we don't have much emotive language there, do we? Hence why I'm saying it's matter of fact. If he's making it to the League of Nations, it's not surprising that it's going to be respectful, because he's not going to want to call out other countries in front of the League of Nations. He's not going to want to score personal debts in front of other countries in the League of Nations, is he? So again, we've done our tone. What about context in this case, right? Again, what in the bigger picture is helping to explain this? Well, in this case, what's happening when the source is being made? Well, the Dawes plan by this stage was providing Germany with money, but many were worrying, and it meant an over-reliance on American loans. Helps to explain maybe why they are why Stresemann is identifying some problems, but maybe not over-egging those problems. He doesn't want America to withdraw the money from Dawes plan, but he also realizes that we've maybe been a bit over-reliant on it. Germany was still overburdened by reparation payments. That is something that's going on at the time. And so he's not going to go to the League of Nations and start shouting and bawling at these people if he's hoping that eventually, as part of that reintegration into international climate, they may reduce those reparation payments, which incidentally they do, don't they, under the Young Plan. Locarno Treaties and Calais-Briand Pact signed that Germany would accept Treaty of Versailles borders. Some in Germany saw this as given into Versailles. And when he refers then to those problems that existed in Germany, he's referring to that, isn't he? That failure to accept the Treaty of Versailles. And he's recognizing that. And also the fact that Germany was accepted into the League of Nations in 1926, 100% helps to explain this as well. That context, that looking at the bigger picture, helps you to see the value of it, doesn't it? Because he's maybe speaking less truthfully if he's bearing all these things in mind, if he's bearing in mind that Germany's still overburdened by reparation payments and he's looking possibly for some help from the international climate. So again, write that up as part of that paragraph. Context, done. Reliability, again, we're thinking about bias, we're thinking about audience, we're thinking about purpose. So in this case, right, it's written by the foreign minister. So he's at the center of government. He's at the center of that government policy making, and so he is going to be most aware of it, or more aware of it than many, many other people making these sources at the time. He may make, though, a bit of a rosier picture for that international audience in order to create confidence. He wants to create a confidence in this German nation, that this German nation is going to succeed, it's going to be responsible in the international climate, it's not going to cause another world war, etc. So, if we think about reliability, that may reduce the reliability of it, mightn't it? And then lastly, again, our judgment, right, or our validity, strengths, perspective, value for things that increase validity, weaknesses, omissions, biases that decrease the validity. So what can we say? Well, it's from a knowledgeable source. It's a fairly accurate picture at the time, to be honest, right? If we think about everything that's happening, you know, in the middle of this golden era, it's a fairly accurate picture. And also he wanted Weimar to succeed, so he is trying to, you know, maybe not, he's trying to maybe underestimate the problems, put a positive spin on it. Now, all of those words you can kind of use, right? Knowledgeable source, accurate picture. You can use those words when you're writing your answers. It's also, what takes away from its validity, it's tailored for a certain audience, isn't it? It's tailored to those international countries. And that's going to maybe reduce its validity to you as a historian, reduce its ability to really give you the whole picture. It was during the golden era where things were looking a little bit rosy. And speeches sometimes can be emotive. I know I refer to the tone as being matter of fact, right? And I think I'd stand by the fact it's matter of fact. But speeches sometimes can be emotive, and maybe that might reduce its validity as well, possibly. So again, right, you've now done your validity. Now, we're not going to have time to do the other source together, right? But, you know, you get the picture. Follow these, right? Provenance, date, authorship, audience, form and language, content, tone, context, reliability, and judgment. So I've got these here, right, for the other source. We'll just whiz through. So there, you'll see the resource on the website, and you'll be able to flick through at your leisure. Ultimately, then, you need to make an overall judgment, right? Overall, How valuable do you think these sources are to a historian understanding the problems of Weimar Germany? So judgment, by that we're referring to you talking about the validity of these sources. So after completing a checklist for each of the sources, all that's left for you to do then is, in a separate paragraph, to make an overall judgment in a conclusion. So the first thing to mention, right, is that all sources have some value. So you can't ever really write these sources don't have a value to a historian, because they have value, even if that value is just understanding a highly biased perspective. So that first example, written by a communist that tried and failed to overthrow Weimar democracy, it's not very good at telling us about the problems of Weimar Germany, but it is very good in giving us the perspective of someone that was probably the closest to overthrowing Weimar Germany, at least in the early period. You must say how valuable these sources are to historians in answering, proving, or disproving the theory in the question. And the absolute crucial thing to do for this is use that word value. That word value is used in the question. So make sure you use that word. These sources do have value. This source is valuable. This source is less valuable. By using that word value, you're signposting the examiner to answering that specific question. Now you must make some of these comments right throughout, right at the end of each source, right? This source, as we did in that checklist, some validity, not less validity, but you must then do it as part of your overall conclusion. Overall, do these sources have value to a historian looking at that specific issue, whether that's problem in Weimar Germany, whether that is explaining Oliver Cromwell's success in the battles. I'm not sure if that's actually what you do in that unit, but still. And sustain your judgment throughout. If you've said, for example, when you're discussing source A, that it is highly valuable because of this, this, and this, in your conclusion, don't then say source A is not very valuable because of this and this. You've got to sustain your judgment. You've got to stick to your guns, right? If I said it's highly valuable once, then I'm going to stick to that. I'm going to say it's highly valuable again. If you start to waver, the examiner thinks you don't really know what you're talking about. If you're saying it is highly valuable in one area, then not highly valuable in another area, the examiner's just going to think you're not really sure what you're saying. So stick to that judgment, sustain it. And linking those sources to each other and the set question is a way to do that as well, right? More valuable than, less valuable than. Now, I think almost lastly, right, what examiners may annotate on your answers, right? If you ever get the paper back, or if you've seen examples that your teacher or lecturers maybe got from the exam board and given to you, you might see these codes written on those essays, on those questions, right? S discusses the strength of the source in relation to the content and their language, the strengths of it. And as I said right at the beginning of the night, you need to look at both the strengths and the limitations in order to analyze. So L refers to, you've discussed the limitations of the sources, not she sources, the sources. So maybe you've referred to the omissions, the things that source has left out, that hasn't been included. ATT, right? You've used or uses the attribution to discuss the utility of the source, for example, origin and purpose. So if you've got, something back from the exam board, look at it to see where you have, or where that person who's done it has included origin and purpose, and look at the comments that they've made. What types of thing have they said? S/E, right? Valid source evaluation comments on, for example, bias, reliability, validity. CXT, discuss the historical context surrounding the sources. V, discusses the value of the sources to historians. OM, a list of general omissions of coverage. And UCN, narrative events. Those bottom two aren't so good, right? You don't want to see those bottom two. But those top ones you do want to see. You want to see them littered throughout any essay question that you're writing, or you've got back from the exam board. You could even ask your teacher or your lecturer to try and do that when they're marking your essay, possibly, right? So you're identifying where in it you are looking at validity and you're making evaluative comments, or where you are looking at the limitations of the sources and of the source's content and language. Those are good tools to help you, right? So what I suggest you do, right, feel free to take me up on it or not, is you take that checklist and you apply it to a question 1 question from your from your option, whatever option you're doing, right? If you're doing option 8, democracy to dictatorship, then use this one you've got here and write it up to an answer. If you're doing one of those other options, take it from one of those, write it up as an answer. So that kind of brings us to an end of what I've got to say on that, and perfect timing for 5 minutes of questions at the end. Just before I do, right, just a reminder, we've done today then, right, question 1 on how to master it. Hopefully that's given you some clear and concise tips on how to do well at that question. Next Thursday, next week, we'll look at Unit 2, still at Unit 2, but question 2, so that interpretation question. The following Thursday then, we'll look at Unit 1, particularly looking at the content, which seems pretty big in comparison to Unit 2. And then the following week after that, we'll look at essay writing, how to write a good essay for Unit 1, which is a very different assessment method, isn't it, to Unit 2. And hopefully you've realised that over the course of the last year.